In this episode, kinesiology professor Dr. Carly Adams explores the past. Drawing on a number of projects, Carly explores how oral histories allow us to consider, question, and in some instances rewrite dominant narratives of community, sport, and social change. Dr. Adams will highlight the value of conducting oral histories both as a methodological strategy and as a form of activist research.
Thanks, Matt, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. When I saw that the Harlem Globetrotters were in town tonight, I thought, I might be standing here on my own. What a wonderful event this is every month. I'm so delighted to be here tonight speaking to all of you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about two things that I'm passionate about: oral histories and sport histories. But before I begin, I have some thank yous. Thank you to Catherine Reeder and the Faculty of Arts and Science for organizing these amazing talks and making them happen, and for everything that you've done, including spell checking my PowerPoint at the last minute. Thank you, Catherine. And most importantly, I want to thank and express my gratitude to all of the individuals, some of whom are in this room tonight, and others who are no longer with us, who have shared their life experiences with me and my research teams, and who have consented to have their stories shared to become part of our historical record. Your stories have had an incredible impact on how we understand the world around us, and they reinforce both why the past matters, but also how the past, present, and future are connected. As Matt said, I'm one of the founding members of the Center for Oral History and Tradition that we established at the university in 2013. The center brings together faculty, students, and community members with a wide range of areas of interest and expertise across many disciplines like history, sociology, kinesiology, women and gender studies, indigenous studies, and anthropology. The impetus for establishing the center came from an oral history project that Dr. Jim Tagg, Dr. Heidi McDonald, and University archivist Mike Perry started in 2009, called the First Generation of the University of Lethbridge. This particular project produced over 70 interviews with administrators, faculty, staff, and over 30 interviews with folks who were students at the U of L from 1967 until 1975. All of these interviews were edited, and they're available through the university's digital archive. This project really revealed the need for such a center in southern Alberta. The Center for Oral History and Tradition now has partnerships and relationships with dozens of museums and archives across southern Alberta who are all interested in uncovering, archiving, and making public oral histories that shed light on the past in our communities. I'm really proud of the work we've done over the last 7 years and that we continue to do. In 2017, for example, we launched the 50 Years, 50 Voices project in honor of the University of Lethbridge's 50th anniversary. Tracy McNabb was the project manager, and she worked diligently with many graduate students and faculty members to make this project happen. We also run community beginner and intermediate oral history workshops. Perhaps some of you have attended one of these at the university or at the Galt Museum. I recognize some familiar faces from some of those. Most recently, in October, the current director of the center, Dr. Carol Williams, worked with Dale Leffingwell of the Milk River Historical Society to offer a beginner workshop in Milk River. It was such an incredible day. We had over 30 people in attendance, community members, people from local organizations, students from the university, all interested in learning about how to do oral history, how to begin an oral history project, how to record and document little-known histories about southern Alberta. So, what is oral history? Well, oral history is a method of collecting historical information. Oral histories record remembrances from individuals who were involved in or who witnessed past events. They provide reflections and insights into people, their relationships, the hows and whys of their actions. And they can potentially offer new insights and information that's not available through our written sources. As oral historian Alessandro Portelli wrote, Oral sources tell us just not what people did, but also what they wanted to do and what they believed. Oral history is at the core of much of the work I do as a historian. I'm most interested in speaking to people about their sport and physical activity practices to learn about how and why people make sense of, explain, rationalize their experiences within the context of their lives and what's happening around them. What did it mean to them? What barriers did they face? How did these challenges or successes impact their lives? What did their experiences mean within the context of the social, cultural, economic, political moment of the era? Some of you may have significant memories of playing sport. I was going to say fond memories, but a good friend of mine reminded me a few days ago that not all memories of sport and physical activity are fond or positive. But the basketball court or the the ball diamond, the hockey or curling rink, may have been a space where you explored moving your body, perhaps in ways that were not acceptable off the ice or off the field. You were testing the boundaries of your physical activity, physical ability. Or perhaps the baseball diamond or the ice rink was a place you went to make new friends, or to see your friends, or to take a break from your hectic family life or long days at work. In my history, my personal history, there are many moments of celebration, of that first basket or winning shot, but also moments of triumph over adversity and barriers, both structural barriers, such as a high school physical education teacher who told me and some of my friends that since we were girls and we didn't understand the rules of football, we should just sit on the sidelines and hang out there. And of course, personal barriers that we all have. For me, lack of self-confidence and uncertainty in my ability. I experienced that last year when I joined the Ulethbridge Old-Timers Women's Hockey League for the first time and stepped onto the ice wearing equipment for the first time ever. I've been researching women's hockey for almost 2 decades, but for various reasons I had never actually played the game. And I decided it was time to learn. Well, that was challenging, both physically and emotionally. I was really awful. And it turns out learning a new sport in your 40s is pretty darn hard. So my point is that it's the moments of the everyday that interest me. It's the relationships, the emotions, the hows and the whys of people's actions. I'm passionate about this, about advocating for speaking with people and about oral histories. And I value oral history even more now in our current moment, where social media and digital everything seems to be taking over our lives. A number of years ago, I was at a talk by one of my friends and academic mentors, Dr. Heidi MacDonald, and she asked the audience questions to get them thinking about the value of oral history. So channeling Dr. MacDonald, I have a few questions for you. How many of you keep a diary or a journal? Hands up. An actual book that you open, I see some hands going down. An actual book that you open every day, that you write about your experiences, your feelings, your day-to-day moments. Only a handful. Oh, one over there. Great. Who here writes a letter at least once a week? It can be typed or handwritten, but it needs to be sent through the post, not through email. Ooh, fabulous. One at the back. Who reads a paper copy of a newspaper every day? A physical paper where you feel the smooth pages of the newsprint, the smell of the musty scent of the paper press, that you fold up and you offer to the person next to you, or you cut something out to save for later. I'm delighted to see so many hands going up. Who knows someone in their 20s that does all of this? Could be your kids, could be a friend, could be you. Someone in their 20s who regularly writes in a journal, reads a newspaper. Great. Who knows someone in their 20s who writes a letter at least, let's say once a month. Once a week might be pushing it a little bit. Once a month? Okay, the odd hand. So I ask you these questions. I think I've I'm ahead of myself. There we go. I ask you these questions to get you thinking about the ways that our historical sources have changed over the last 2 decades, with this increasing reliance and importance of social media. The internet, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, online newspapers and magazines. It's rare for us to do this, to write a handwritten letter, to keep a diary, to correspond with someone through the post, to write and send an actual Christmas card. How many of you are still sending Christmas cards? I've actually gone back to doing it in the last couple of years. Oh, quite a few of you. Print newspapers are also struggling to remain alive. Who knows if they'll even exist in another decade? What this means is that we're not producing and keeping sources of information that historians tend to count on. One of my greatest joys as a historian is to dig through a box in the archive, or that somebody pulled from their closet that has letters, pictures, documents, that tells me something about a small piece of the past. I know. When I admit this to my students, they think, oh my goodness, who is this woman who loves digging through strangers' things? But nothing delights me more. My point is that the nature of our sources are changing as social media takes over and paper-based communications are being lost. And digital communication is just not being archived in the same way. So this is one reason why doing oral history is increasing in importance. We can get information, we can find out things, a different perspective from speaking with people, sharing stories with them that we were sometimes able to get from other sources, but often we can't now. I could interview some of you to ask you about your day, your life experiences, and we could preserve that in an oral history collection. I could interview 10 individuals who knew you, your grade 9 teacher, your best friend, your mother, the neighbor down the street that maybe you didn't get along with so well, that might give me a different perspective, your boss, the person at the local market that you talk about politics with every Sunday morning. All of these people would tell me something different about you. They would provide a different perspective and insight into your life and your experiences. Or I could interview you personally about the history of Ulethbridge, perhaps, your experiences, your perceptions, events that you were involved with, or about something more specific, like sport. What do you know about the history of hockey in Ulethbridge? The history of the Hurricanes or the Western Hockey League? Or let's go even further back. What do you know about the histories of the arenas in the city? When were they built? What curling teams or hockey teams have graced the ice throughout the years? When was the first artificial ice plant installed? And how did this change the game of curling or of hockey? What do you know about the Ulethbridge Native Sons or the Ulethbridge Vets, the Ulethbridge Thistles, or the military hockey leagues that were in the city during the Second World War? How do you know about this? Were you there? Was it through stories passed down from your parents or grandparents or relatives? Or maybe you were a part of one of these teams. Perhaps you just learned about the Ulethbridge Thistles from Lethbridge cartoonist Eric Dick this past November when you were browsing through the Christmas market at Casa. Eric and textile artist Carla Mather-Cox from Mogo Pomo Supply and Design have been collaborating to produce these incredible tea towels, I have one on the screen here for you, that celebrate the history of southern Alberta. And in the fall, they brought to light the history of the Lethbridge Thistles. I have one here too, I've been carrying mine around with me lately. And this is to celebrate the history of the Lethbridge Thistles, a women's hockey team from the 1920s. With some digging, they cobbled together the starting lineup of the team and created this tea towel, which depicts the team playing against their rivals, the Coleman Crystals. With the towel comes a tag that tells a little bit about the history of women's hockey in southern Alberta in the 1920s. And yes, you can kind of see on the screen, I've been turned into a cartoon character. There's a first for everything. It was very exciting. And this will be framed and put on my office wall, because what else would you do when some of your research becomes part of a tea towel collaboration? You frame it and you put it on your office wall. And I also need to point out that one of the things I love most about this is that there are women playing in a tabletop hockey game. How many of you have ever seen women on a tabletop hockey game? Amazing. I love it. As an aside, there's still a few towels for sale, but they've almost sold out. It's been quite phenomenal to follow. I ran into Eric on campus on Tuesday. He's currently our cartoonist in residence, and he tells me there are 8 towels left. So if any of you would like one, you better hurry. I can give you the details at the end of the talk. So as I'm speaking tonight, I want you to think about your life. I want you to think about organizations, associations, businesses, clubs that you're involved with, your own history, or your family histories. What do you know about these histories? And more importantly, what don't you know? Whose voices and what stories are missing or have been silenced? So not surprising then, tonight I want to talk about the value of conducting oral histories, both as a methodological strategy, a way of doing history, and as a form of activism. Drawing on stories from 2 research projects that are separated by space and time, one from the very beginning of my career that continues to be a prominent area of research for me, and the other that's a much more recent focus that Matt mentioned, the Nikkei Memory Capture Project. And I want to explore how oral histories allow us to consider, question, and in some cases rewrite dominant narratives of community and sport. On the one hand, I want to share with you the case of the Preston Rivulets, arguably the greatest women's hockey team ever to lace up their skates. I know, a huge claim given that probably most of you have never heard of the Preston Rivulets. They were a remarkable group of athletes, and I want to tell you about them. Then I want to share some research coming out of this current project, out of the Nikkei Memory Capture Project, with Dr. Darren Aoki from Plymouth University in the UK. Darren couldn't be here tonight. I spoke to him yesterday, and he's going to be watching this online, but his mom is in the audience. Thank you, Rita, for being here tonight. Through this project, we consider community rebuilding in the Japanese-Canadian community in southern Alberta in the post-war period. And the stories I'm going to share tonight could be told as stories of discrimination, exclusion, racism, sexism, oppression, injustice. Certainly these stories are all of those. To be clear, it's really important to understand these stories in this way. But tonight I want to encourage you to do something different with them. I want to encourage you to hear them differently, from a different perspective. I encourage you to hear them instead as stories of resiliency, agency, strength, aspiration, and achievement. Hear a story that includes more perspectives and amplifies voices and experiences that are too often ignored, silenced, or forgotten. Individually and together, these projects highlight the value of oral histories, both in terms of drawing attention to histories that are too often left in the margins of our scholarly work, and the stories we tell about histories in Canada, and in reminding ourselves and each other about critical moments, people, communities, in the histories of the places and spaces that we inhabit. I have focused much of my work, sorry, I'm a little bit behind. I was supposed to be doing this while I was chatting. My apologies. Oh, there we go. I have focused much of my work over the past 2 decades on Canadian women's hockey. And I'm always intrigued by the presence, or more often absences, of the history of women's hockey and the way we understand these stories that we hear about through television, radio, or on social media. I want you to think about recent developments in women's hockey that you may have heard about, stories that you saw in the news or read about on social media. The folding of the Canadian Women's Hockey League in 2018. The Dream Gap Tour that's currently happening across the country. The amazing athletes that are fighting for a professional league so they too can compete and showcase the highest levels of their sport and be supported for doing so. Or Hayley Wickenheiser being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, one of the few women who have been bestowed this honor. What do you know about these moments, and whose voices are missing? In 1997, I was in the first year of university taking my first sport history class with Dr. Alan Metcalf at the University of Windsor in Ontario. In the textbook, I came across a reference to the Preston Rivulets, women's hockey team. The author described the team as the most successful women's hockey team in Canadian history. I was immediately interested. Who was it? Who were these women? And then also immediately frustrated because I couldn't find any other information about the team. How did this remarkable women's team get no mention in any of the books about Canadian hockey? How were there no books on the library shelves about them? I wanted to know more. Who were these women? How did they accomplish so much? And what did it mean to them to be playing hockey in the 1930s? What challenges and barriers did they face and push back against to be able to lace up their skates and step onto the ice in front of arenas packed to the rafters with as many as 3,000 people on a Friday night? What other teams existed in the 1920s and 30s? Since that first sport history class, I've been hooked. I wanted to know more about women athletes of the past and why they so often seem to be absent from the stories we tell about our sporting past in Canada. I've since dedicated much of my career to researching, writing, and teaching about sport experiences and the stories that are often marginalized or silenced behind some of the more dominant narratives of sport in Canada. So I have some more questions for you. How many of you can name 5 players from the National Hockey League, the NHL? Probably all of us, many of us. What about from the National Women's Hockey League, the NWHL? One person, great. What about hockey players from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, or 60s? Have you heard of Gordie Howe? Yep. Eddie Shore? Maurice the Rocket Richard? Yep. Bobby Orr? Yep. What about Hilda Ranscombe? Eva Alt? Marm Schmuck? Shirley Cameron? Oh, I thought there might be a chance with that one. Shirley's from Alberta. There's a really rich history of women playing hockey in Canada, a history that we're still just beginning to uncover and understand the popularity and extent of, especially during the first half of the 20th century. The first organized game of women's hockey in Alberta is said to be a match that took place in Medicine Hat in 1897. While we're still piecing together the history of women's hockey in Alberta, there are dozens of news reports of women's games, exhibitions, and even leagues that attracted hundreds, sometimes thousands of spectators. Eric got to see much of this when he was doing this research for the Tea Towel. He came by my office and I said, here, 6 binders full of newspapers. Isn't this amazing? Anyway. So for example, when I'm talking about news reports, these news reports suggest that women's teams played regularly. For example, here's a team from Banff that played host to a visiting Calgary team as early as 1908. And following the first Banff Winter Carnival in 1917, the Banff newspaper, the Craig and Canyon, noted that women's hockey had been one of the best money-getters of the first carnival. The press reported a match between 2 women's hockey teams as a feature event on the closing day. The Calgary teams, the Crescents and the Regents, competed for the title in front of a large crowd. And according to the news report that I have on the screen here for you, the Regents won a hard-fought contest with a score of 1-0. Close checking was one of the main features, many members of both teams receiving bad spills. So women's teams competed at the annual tournament that was held at the Carnival from 1917 until 1937. By the early 1920s, women's hockey was really popular among working women, and companies often sponsored teams. For example, in the 1920s, there were at least 24 women's industrial hockey teams in various leagues just in Calgary alone. Across the country, women's hockey at the time had a reputation of being a working-class women's pastime, where brawls, aggressive play, and injuries were commonplace, just like in men's hockey, and they were often discussed in the news reports. Headlines from news reports, such as these on the screen from the Toronto Daily Star from the 1930s, read things like, "Sticks and fists fly freely as girl hockeyists battle. Girls wanted another fight, but the referees stopped them. Hockey Amazons in fistic display." Headlines like this suggest that women were playing a tough, aggressive form of hockey, and accounts from some of the players we've spoken with certainly confirm this. In Alberta, press reports during the 1920s suggest that the women's game was not quite as clean as critics might have liked. Headlines such as "Girls Fight in Lacombe Hockey," "Free-for-all staged after Ponoka ladies score winning count," "Hard and scrappy game played by girls Wednesday on ice at Banff," and my favorite, "No hair pulling or primping at the ice arena last night, only real hockey." So these again suggest that aggressive play and even fighting were common. In 1920, after a game between Calgary and Fernie, one reporter wrote, "There was considerable rough play in the 3 periods. The second period found the members of the gentle sex humping one another rather freely, and several of them were escorted to the penalty box." Yet by the 1920s, there were also clear expectations of women hockey players. There was one and only one prescribed way that women's hockey should be played. An aggressive play was not okay. Fighting on the ice was not okay if you were a woman. Women were publicly and privately chastised for their unladylike behavior. After a game between the Calgary Regents and the Fernie Swastikas in 1922, a reporter for the Calgary Herald scolded the players for their actions on the ice, stating, quote, "Regents resorted to rough play on more than one occasion. The ladies must remember that although hockey dished up by them in the past has been appreciated, the fans will not tolerate any rough stuff. And besides, it will not get them anywhere but in the cooler." So with this historical context in mind, I'd like to share with you the story of the Preston Rivulets, the most successful team in the history of women's hockey. How many of you had heard of the Rivulets prior to me mentioning them tonight? A couple? I'd love to speak with you afterwards about how. From 1931 until 1940, this team dominated women's hockey in Canada, claiming 10 provincial and 4 national championships. And the only years they didn't win the national championship, most of them were because they didn't happen. They had to, the tournament couldn't take place for various reasons. They were known by news reporters across the country as the Queens of the Ice. And they were successful, aggressive, and physically powerful athletes, expressing attributes that were neither expected nor admired in women in sport during this era. They won over 95% of their games, and this record is paralleled in sport history only by the Edmonton Grads women's basketball team. Who's heard of the Edmonton Grads basketball team? Oh, good. More hands. Another amazing story for another time. The Preston Rivulets hockey games at the Galt Arena became a popular civic ritual for the town of Preston, Ontario, a town of 6,000 people and now part of the city of Cambridge in Ontario. A ritual that was desperately needed to boost morale during the Depression era of the 1930s. On December 22nd, 2017, the Canadian government, through the Historical Sites and Monument Program, recognized the historical significance of this remarkable team. We had a lovely ceremony in Cambridge with 150 family members and friends there to celebrate the team, and the Cambridge Rivulets wore the names of the women from the 1930s on the backs of their jerseys. It was an incredible celebration and one that was long, long overdue. In that same year, Tracy Power's stage play, Glory, based on the story of the Rivulets, brought to light through some of the research I had done, began its cross-Canada tour. So within a decade, this team and the history of women's hockey in Ontario in the 1930s went from being largely unknown to holding a fairly prominent place in popular and academic understandings of Canada's sporting past. Throughout the 1930s, the Rivulets played dozens of league, exhibition, and championship contests against teams within the province and across the country, including against the Edmonton Rustlers, who incidentally the Rivulets lost to in 1933 at the first national championship for women's hockey. So we hold the first national championship here in the province. In 2002, while digging in the archives looking for information about the Rivulets, I met someone who introduced me to Ruth Dargell, one of the last surviving members of the team. As a new researcher, I'd never really thought about the possibilities of doing oral history as historical method. I was so nervous meeting Ruth. It was my first oral history interview, and I didn't really know what to expect. As I drove up to her apartment building in Kitchener, Ontario, I kept thinking about what little information I was able to gather about the team, and I could barely contain my excitement about what she might tell me. I can remember knocking on Ruth's apartment door, and as soon as the door opened, a wave of cigarette smoke greeted me. And within seconds, I had this little dog nipping at my heels. As I entered the apartment, I was more than a little bit apprehensive. But then I looked around, and on the wall above her couch, among her family photos, were pictures of a women's hockey team. A picture of Ruth in her Rivulets uniform in 1938, that's on the screen here, the program from a series of games in PEI in 1939, and the certificate from when the team was inducted into the Cambridge Sports Hall of Fame in 1998. That these things still hung on her wall decades later spoke to the importance of this moment in her life and how proud she was to have been a part of this team. I knew then that Ruth was going to share with me a very different perspective about what it meant to play hockey in the 1930s, a very different story from the wins and losses and play-by-plays of the games that I had found in newspaper accounts. Asking Ruth my first question, with a dog sitting on my lap because I had to pet it the whole interview for 2 hours just so we could chat, that first question that I asked Ruth changed the nature of my research and set me on this path as an oral historian. Born in 1923, the youngest of 5 siblings and the only girl, Ruth learned to play hockey on the outdoor ponds with her brothers. She said, quote, "When I was small, I had a brother that played, and I had speed skates at the time, and he said to my dad, 'You get her off those speed skates and get her on tube skates.' He said, 'I'm not playing with her like that.' We were playing in the backyard, and that's how I got started." Debuting on February 5th in 1938, Ruth was one of the youngest players of the Rivulets, playing on what was affectionately known in the press as the kid line. She recalls that it was her mother who arranged for her to try out with the team. It was my mom who got me going. Herb Fash's boy, Herb Fash was the coach, he was a mailman. So she says to him one day, she wants to play, and he says, well, bring her down. So I went down and got on the team. In April 1939, the Rivulets traveled east to defend their title against the Islanders of Charlottetown, PEI, maritime champions. For Ruth, this 7-day team trip to PEI was her first time away from home. She recalls the trip as her most memorable experience with the team. She said, "We left here from Preston on a Friday. Took pretty near a week. Then pausing to look up at the scorecard above her couch, she said, 'We had such a great time.' 10 players with their coach, a manager, and their chaperone. Women's teams couldn't travel anywhere without their chaperone in the 1930s. They left Preston in April around Easter by train, and after a short layover in Montreal, they reached the Atlantic. Traveling to PEI on the SS Charlottetown ferry was an adventure for the players. Dargel shared, "When we went on the boat, we had an ice cutter, and he had to cut the ice in order to get going. It was a rough ride. Upon reaching the town, the daughter of the Charlottetown MP met the ferry, and we went on our tour of the city, including the Parliament buildings where each girl received a coin. Eager to retain their Dominion title, the Rivulets soundly defeated the Charlottetown Islanders by a combined score of 11-3 over 2 games. News reports suggest that 1,000 people witnessed the games over 2 days. Throughout our interviews, Ruth shared stories about how meaningful it was for her to be one of the youngest players of the team, and how the older players were like sisters, mentors, and coaches, both on and off the ice. She spoke about how incredible it was that thousands of people would come to the arena to watch them, to watch her team play, and what it was like to be in front of these big crowds. She spoke about injuries and fights that would break out on the ice, about how some people really didn't like their unladylike behavior on the ice. So she told stories about experiences of a young girl in small-town Ontario and the joys and frustrations of playing hockey in the 1930s. This is how I do research, from the bottom up. I'm interested in rethinking existing understandings, thinking of voices like Ruth's that are sometimes silenced or absent from our historical narratives, and what these experiences tell us about their social worlds. Since 2002, through various projects I've worked on, I've explored politics of representation, issues of voice and experience, citizenship, tensions between amateurism and professionalism, notions of community, governance structures, institutional discrimination, agency, identity, resiliency. But through all this, it has been the silences and the new ways of understanding and narrating the past that intrigue me the most as an oral historian. Recognizing, of course, that women's involvement in sport did not necessarily create widespread cultural shifts or overthrow some of our dominant cultural norms, but that in certain pockets of the country and around the world, women were actively participating in sport and leisure, and through this, they actively fought to create more satisfying personal narratives in their participation and public displays as athletes. So it's pretty fair to say there have been a lot of twists and turns through my career as an oral historian. Meeting Dr. Darren Aoki in 2016 marks the most recent shift. In 2017, Darren and I launched the Nikkei Memory Capture Project, a multi-year oral history project that initiates the narration and analysis of the cultural and social history of Japanese Canadians from 1950 to the present, here in southern Alberta. Our project specifically examines the second half of the 20th century, and we attempt to shift academic and public historical attention away from the internment, away from histories of oppression and injustice, while not forgetting them, of course, which have so often dominated historical study, and instead to record memories of everyday life and to ask, then what happened? Since the formal launch at the Galt Museum in 2017, our project has grown immensely. To date, over 100 people have shared their time and their memories and their stories and experiences with us. Some of you are in the room tonight, so let me take a moment to tell you how grateful I am to have met you and to spend time with you through this project. We've collected hundreds of hours of interviews, recording for the first time the experience of Southern Alberta Japanese Canadians. Since 2017, our student research team has also continued to grow, and I really want to mention them here because these individuals are central to the work that we do. It began with the work of Shannon Ingram, Simon Leon, Shelby Simpson, and Elaine Toth, who's in the room tonight. And this past year, we have welcomed Darcy Tamiosi and Madison Allen to our team. We also have some very exciting relationships with community partners, and I'd like to recognize the folks at the Galt Museum and Archives, the Nikkei Cultural Society of Lethbridge and area, and Michelle Day and everyone at the Nikkei Garden. We're delighted to continue our collaboration to showcase the oral history work of the Nikkei Memory Capture Project with the Garden as it opens its newest Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in 2021. In the summer of 2017, and this is where I want to start my next story, we were involved in a number of events at the Garden in celebration of their 50th anniversary. In July, we helped to host a dinner series on the grounds of the Garden. Each night had a different theme with a panel of local experts, some of you are also in the room tonight, speaking about their experiences. The first of the dinner series was about sport in the Japanese Canadian community. And one of the guest speakers at the event was Hollis Pickerel. Hollis, Sansei, third-generation Japanese Canadian, grew up on a farm near Tabor, Alberta, where her family grew sugar beets, potatoes, and corn. When she was a teenager, she got involved in curling through the Tabor Curling Club, and for over 20 years, she has been the secretary-treasurer of the Tabor Organizing Committee for the annual Alberta Japanese Canadian Curling Bonspiel. At the event in July 2017, Hollis spoke about her family's involvement in curling and what it meant to her and still means to her. She shared her own memories and her experiences, as well as stories of curling that had been passed down to her by her father, her uncles, and other friends and family members who were involved in curling following the relocation of many Japanese Canadian families to southern Alberta during the 1940s. Since she was a child, curling has been a central part of Hollis's life. Through curling, Hollis and her family and friends found important spaces for community building, self-expression, and intergenerational physical activity. When Darren and I first started speaking about this research, he shared with me some of the earlier oral histories that he had done with Nikkei, second-generation Japanese Canadians in Lethbridge. Of course, given my research interests, I was immediately drawn to some of the stories and memories that were told about sport and recreation, about Sunday baseball games, all-night curling matches, and the annual Japanese-Canadian curling Bonspiel, and golf and bowling tournaments. When I heard Hollis speak in the summer of 2017, I wanted to know more. Oh, now I've gone too far. On February 14th to 16th, coming up in just a few weeks this year, Lethbridge is going to host the 68th annual Alberta Japanese-Canadian Curling Bonspiel. This is a tournament that first started in 1953 as a small 8-team event, and 6 decades later, it's grown into a 3-day tournament with more than 50 teams each year, attracting participants from across Alberta, British Columbia, occasionally from other parts of Canada, and even Japan. The itinerary for the weekend includes social events, opportunities for shared food and drink, a silent auction, Hall of Fame inductions, a banquet, a junior clinic for children, and other entertainments. The tournament is about much more than curling. But let's have some background. Let's think about the background of curling. Curling was imported to Canada by early Scottish settlers in the late 18th century. As a sport, curling has been linked to Canadian national identity through settler colonial legacies. And curling has been a really popular sport in Canada since the early 1900s, but it was played long before that across the country, expanding with the Western movement of the railroad in the 19th century. Fast forward 50 years, and in the words of historian Karen Wall, from the 1950s to the end of the 1970s, prairie people led the country in curling. In 1960-61, for instance, the region held 17% of Canada's population, but 66% of the nation's curling clubs, and 48% of all curlers. Yet, like the history of women's hockey that I was speaking about earlier, the history of curling in Canada really hasn't received that much attention. Curling has long been romanticized as a sport centered around the socializing aspect of the events, as a sport that is welcome to all abilities and ages, and tied to rural rinks and rural communities. Many of the stories that people have shared with us really speak to this social aspect of the sport. One person explained that in the early 1950s, the idea for the Japanese-Canadian Bonspiel, this curling tournament, came about late one evening during a poker match. Someone said, "Hey, why don't we have a curling Bonspiel?" The JC Bonspiel began as a social gathering mostly among men, an event that over the years became really quite competitive. The early Bonspiels were described as, quote, wild times for the men, most of whom were young, single, and sowing their wild oats. Because they were playing on natural ice, sometimes the curling matches were all-night affairs. Hollis recalled anecdotes passed down by her father and uncles of late-night matches. She shared, "I've heard stories, too, where since it was natural ice, if it was too warm, they would go for 24 hours. If it was too warm, they would just have to wait for the ice to freeze. So then they'd be curling at midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning just to get the games in." The curling matches often took place alongside or were followed by all-night poker games. Tosh Kaneshiro, born in Ocean Falls, British Columbia in 1938, was relocated to a sugar beet farm near Iron Springs, Alberta. He became involved in curling after moving to Lethbridge in the late 1950s. Tosh explained that evacuees who came to southern Alberta brought their love of sport with them as they settled into the many villages and small towns to which they had been relocated. In the summer, they congregated on the ball diamond, and in the winter, the curling rink. He suggested that sport was an important way for the Japanese community to get together socially. The first JC Bonspiel was held in Lethbridge on March 29th in 1953. 8 teams competed, 1 from Lethbridge, Raymond, Coaldale, and Brooks, and 2 from each of Pitcher Butte and Tabor. The entry fee at the time in 1953 was $8, and each team played 2 4-end games. Since the 1950s, the JC Bonspiel has been an annual winter tradition in many Japanese-Canadian families in Alberta. When we asked about the early days of the Bonspiel and some of the oldest members, Kazumi Tricky Oikawa's name is often mentioned first. Born in 1931 in New Westminster, British Columbia, and relocated with his family to Picture Butte, Tricky is reputed to have played in every Bonspiel from 1953 until he passed away at the age of 82 in 2013. A decorated curler capturing the men's title 4 times in 1955, 65, 68, and in 1970, he was once described by the Ulethbridge Herald as the smooth cigar-smoking skip. Before I wrap up tonight, I want to conclude today by sharing with you one of the most incredible afternoons that I have spent engaged in this research, and there have been many incredible afternoons. Through Hollis, I was introduced to Elsie Sasaki. In December 2018, Elsie invited me to her home in Tabor to speak with her about her passion for curling. When I arrived, her kitchen table was filled with pictures, trophies, scrapbooks, you name it. Born in Langley Prairie, British Columbia, as one of 14 children, Elsie had been an avid curler for almost 70 years. Indeed, when I first met her, she still curled 3 times a week at the age of 86. She fondly shared, "I remember the first time I entered the Japanese Bonspiel. There was no ladies' division at the time. I curled with my brothers in Tabor in an all-nighter, no sleep. It was exhausting." By the late 1960s, Elsie was also an avid curler in a women's league in Tabor, and she was eager for a women's division to be added to the JC Bonspiel. She recalls getting some of the women together and approaching the organizers to add this new division. Although some women entered the JC Bonspiel in the 1950s and 60s as part of mixed teams, a ladies' division was not added until the winter of 1968. The division consisted of 8 teams, 2 from Lethbridge, 2 from Tabor, and individual teams from Rainier, Calgary, Raymond, and Picture Butte. In the 1960s and 70s, it was a transitional and really uncertain and difficult period for women's sport in Canada. There were significant changes taking place in the political and administrative structure, as well as in the meaning of sport in our national imagination. With the increasing professionalization and commercialization of men's sport, women athletes, leaders, and organizers were often left out of the decision-making processes. There were only a few women's sport governing bodies. Speaking on behalf of women, and curling was one of them. It was in 1960 that the Canadian Ladies Curling Association was formed. Indeed, despite the tenuous nature of women's sport, women's curling seemed to be growing across the country in both urban and rural areas. In Western Canada, the rink was increasingly becoming a space for women, especially married women, to be active. And women like Elsie were advocating for and developing the game in rural areas, and they were part of this growth. From the first time that Elsie saw the rocks sliding down the ice in the late 1950s, she was hooked. She recalled, "I learned a lot from watching them, the men. In those days, the men curled in their leather dress shoes and used rubbers, ice grippers, as well. The corn brooms were hilarious. The whole atmosphere just fascinated me. It just fascinated me. The ice, the rocks, those big rocks, 42 pounds, and then the brooms and the sweeping. I thought, wow, this is such a great sport." So I joined the Tabor's Ladies League a year later. It was just fun to go and participate in something different, something that really attracted me. Elsie spoke really passionately about the meaningful conversations that took place off the ice with other women. She said most of us were housewives, so it was nice as a housewife to get out and enjoy something other than your own home life. All of their husbands would have different occupations, and we used to talk about what they did, and the latest in food, latest news, everything. Elsie recalls being both fascinated with the sport, but also really frustrated that there was no one in southern Alberta teaching or coaching curling. She shared, "There was no teaching back then, but I kept watching the men whenever I could. And soon I bought a Ken Watson paperback, as he was demonstrating a leather slider glued onto a boot or shoe. How quickly that slider changed the game of curling. Any chance I got, I would read up information or buy books to get the latest information, but no one really took us out and taught us how to deliver. I was not happy about not having curling clinics for new or prospective curlers like myself. So I inquired and asked if there were teaching courses for curling. Elsie was determined to change this, to create a space where the game could be taught to those who wanted to learn. In the early 1970s, Elsie took courses with the National Curling Association, and soon she earned her instructor's pin. She began teaching at the Tabor Curling Club, and she was then asked to go to other clubs and high schools to teach. She recalls, "I taught in our club in Tabor. Anybody who wanted to learn, we'd have them come." Elsie also inspired her 3 daughters to get involved in the sport. Wanda, Elsie's middle daughter, spoke with pride about following in her mother's footsteps as a curling instructor and a coach. She shared, "I ended up getting certified too as an instructor, and actually I coached Hollis and a group of girls." In reflecting on her life and the significant moments in her life, Elsie immediately went to reflecting on the importance of curling. She said, "Curling was really important in my life. It was the beginning for me to begin who I am today and be happy. It's been a tough road, but really rewarding. And my kids, I love my kids, oh my gosh. Family is the most important thing. Probably one of the best things that has ever happened was to join curling. It gave me a new life to look at. I knew it was going to be hard, living together, starting out farming. I knew it was going to be hard, but I was okay with that. But the curling just brought new life into me. It was like seeing the world differently." In the life histories of Japanese Canadians in southern Alberta, stories of sport and recreation, of community gatherings and celebrations, such as those I've shared today from Elsie, are complicated. They're always already tied to memories of internment, relocation and resettlement, to decisions about where and how to build community and how to be in their everyday lives. Yet the stories and memories shared through the Nikkei Memory Capture Project complicate these dominant narratives of Japanese Canadians in southern Alberta and point to ways that histories of oppression and injustice also are stories of agency, resiliency, aspiration, and hope. In the stories of Ruth, Tosh, Hollis, Elsie, their experiences and their memories, their willingness to share these stories of how and why they did what they did and what it meant in the context of their lives speaks to the importance of oral history. Oral histories are partial, they're complicated, they're fluid, they're a product of conversations, of relationships, of questions asked and answered, and they meaningfully connect the past to the present. The stories invite us into intimate moments, experiences, emotions of the past, and they often challenge us to think about how we understand certain histories. And they lead us to question, why are some voices, some experiences, some stories not part of our historical records, our archives, our narratives, part of the stories that we tell? As you leave here tonight, I encourage you again to think about your own experiences, about the activities and the organizations that you're involved with, about your own histories. How much do you know about these histories, about the people, the moments, and especially about the how and the why? And how do you know what you know? And whose stories are still missing and have been silenced in these histories? Thank you.